When Malcolm Hayes stepped into his office that morning, the sky above Windsor was overcast but calm. The stillness, however, didn't last long. Within moments of switching on his phone, he noticed the urgent ping of back-to-back alerts. Headlines were circulating rapidly. Another podcast episode from Meghan Everly had gone live overnight, and already it was stirring the kind of unrest he had come to recognize instinctively. He closed the blinds halfway, sat at his desk, and played the audio file. The voice was familiar, polished, persuasive, precise. Meghan spoke slowly, as if every word had been weighed in private. She was talking about childhood lessons, about unspoken hierarchies and systems where silence is mistaken for grace. There was no mention of royalty, not explicitly. But Malcolm didn't need to hear the word palace to know who the episode targeted. The metaphors were deliberate, a childhood with measured affection, an adulthood spent unpacking. Inherited restraint. She was painting a portrait without names, but the shadows were clear as he listened. He reached for a pen, scribbling timestamps in the margins of an old press briefing. He already anticipated the calls that would follow. This wasn't just a podcast. It was an ambush wrapped in civility. By the time the kettle had finished boiling, he had already drafted 3 versions of a statement, though he knew none of them would be used. Across the courtyard, in another wing of the building, Julian North was preparing for his meeting with Harry Everly's quiet liaison team. They had been coordinating an unpublicized visit, something low-key, something healing. A spring invitation to Balmoral had been prepared. Letters had been exchanged privately. Progress, Malcolm had thought. Finally, but now everything had shifted. He made the call to Julian, his voice steady as he relayed what he'd heard. Julian didn't interrupt. He simply listened, then asked for the timestamps. Then he closed his own laptop, pushed aside the neat folders he'd arranged, and muttered that the visit would have to be reconsidered. Again, and outside, though the skies remained quiet, the storm had already begun, not with thunder, but with carefully chosen words that would echo louder than any confrontation. Julian North walked the long corridor of the West Wing with slower steps than usual. His brown leather folder, always neatly tucked beneath his arm, felt heavier than it had days before. He had rehearsed so many possibilities over the past few weeks. Conversations that might finally soften the space between father and son, moments where old words could be unknotted with care. But that morning, as he scanned the latest media coverage, he knew none of those conversations would take place now. The podcast had fractured everything. When he reached the private workroom set aside for Harry during his quiet returns to Windsor, the door was already ajar. Julian paused at the threshold. The room was empty. No staff, no security, not even the usual trace of recent use. On the side table, a ceramic mug still held half a cup of tea, now cold. A copy of a poetry collection rested nearby, its corners bent, one page marked with a folded edge. Julian picked it up and read the underlined line silently. Some silences are not peace, but absence wearing a ribbon. He stood for a long while without moving. Then he turned and left. That evening, the call finally came. Harry's voice. On the line was measured but quiet, like someone trying to carry a conversation while holding his breath. He confirmed what Julian already suspected. He had heard the podcast, and no, he hadn't known exactly what would be said before it aired. He insisted there had been no malice, only reflections from a personal past. But as Julian listened, he also heard what wasn't being said. The tiredness, the resignation, the familiar distance creeping in again like a cold draft under a closed door. The next morning, Kensington Palace postponed the scheduled call with the king. No explanation. Just a polite email with a vague suggestion to revisit the idea at a later time. Julian didn't reply. He simply closed the calendar, folded the invitation letter he had helped draft, and placed it in the drawer he used for unsent correspondence, a drawer that had become increasingly full. Elsewhere, the headlines blazed on. Commentators picked apart every metaphor from the podcast. Supporters praised Meghan's candor, while critics accused her of planting barbed truth beneath velvet tones. The palace issued no response, and Meghan, across the ocean, continued with interviews and brand partnerships as if the storm belonged to someone else entirely. Julian, seated by the window later that day, watched as wind stirred the cherry blossoms outside. He thought of everything they had almost built, not reconciliation perhaps, but at least an opening. Now the door had been shut again, not with rage, but with one quiet recording that turned hope into hesitation once more. Malcolm Hayes stood at the edge of the terrace, watching the press vans idle at the far end of the gravel drive. They weren't there for a scandal this time, not officially, just a youth initiative event hosted by one of the lesser royals. But he knew the real reason half of them had come was the unconfirmed report that Harry Everleigh might make a surprise appearance. Malcolm didn't believe he would. He hadn't seen Harry in weeks. No one had. The messages had become shorter, the check-ins rarer. Julian had stopped trying to coax replies and instead focused on cleaning up the silence. It was 3 weeks since the podcast aired, and the palace had adopted what Malcolm called the soft withdrawal. No public comments, no leaked quotes, no backstage conversations with the press. But internally, the mood had changed. There was tension now in meetings where his name came up, Harry's, not Meghan's. Meghan had already left the realm of influenceable space. But Harry? There had still been hope. That hope, Malcolm now realized, had withered quietly. The event began without incident. Cameras rolled. Speeches were given. But there was a moment, brief and weightless, when a staffer handed him a handwritten note. It was unsigned, written in the familiar scrawl of someone not used to sharing thoughts on paper. It read only, "Not today, maybe next year." Malcolm folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket. He didn't show it to anyone. That evening, he met Julian in a corner booth of a pub that had served as their unofficial off-the-record war room for the last 2 years. Julian arrived late, looking like he hadn't slept. They ordered tea, not out of irony, but routine, and sat mostly in silence. Then Malcolm slid the folded note across the table. Julian read it without speaking, then placed it flat between them. After a while, he suggested drafting something again, a letter, a message, even a short note to William's team. But the words sounded thin now, like window frames rattling in wind no one could stop. Across the room, a news channel flickered on mute. Footage played of Meghan smiling at a wellness panel in New York. Her voice, now dubbed over with headlines, spoke about authenticity and redefining legacy. Malcolm watched the screen with detached calm. It wasn't anger he felt, not anymore. It was something else, something quieter. A kind of mourning for the version of Harry they had almost brought home. The men behind the curtain, as the tabloids called them, had become shadows. Their efforts no longer steered the story, they barely slowed it down. And as Malcolm stood to leave, he placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, not for reassurance, but because it was the only real gesture left. In the background, the press vans rolled away. And once again, Windsor fell silent. By the time the first buds of summer crept up the stone wall behind the Balmoral greenhouse, most of the outside world had already moved on. The podcast episode that once consumed headlines had faded into the background of newer scandals and fresher content. But inside the quiet reaches of the estate, where memory clung more tightly than time, the aftermath remained, not loud, but constant. King Charles had not spoken directly about the incident. Not to aides, not to press, not even to those closest to him. But his private secretary had noticed the change. Fewer calls were made, fewer letters answered. One unopened envelope remained on the edge of the writing desk in the king's study. No return address, just a plain wax seal and the faint, unmistakable handwriting of his son. It had been there for weeks now, untouched, collecting dust under the stained glass window where sunlight broke into gentle patterns on the floor. Elsewhere, Julian North had returned to the rhythm of royal operations. His mornings were filled with scheduling briefings, diplomatic protocol memos, and quiet coffees taken alone in the West Corridor. He no longer received updates on Harry's movements. The last he had heard, unofficially, and only through an old friend at the consulate, was that Harry had taken time away from public engagements entirely. He was spending more time with wildlife rehabilitation centers on the Pacific coast. Rarely photographed, always unreachable, Julian didn't press for more. He knew by now that silence could stretch far enough to become comfort. Malcolm Hayes had resigned. Not publicly, not dramatically, just an internal memo, a transfer to a private ethics consultancy, and a quiet farewell gathering with 6 close colleagues. He left behind his office, his folders, and one locked drawer where a draft of a speech still waited, a speech Harry would have given at Balmoral had things turned out differently. It began with the words, "We are not our parents' mistakes, only their memory, trying to love better." Across the Atlantic, Meghan continued to host episodes. Her voice, as always, was calm and confident. She never referenced the backlash directly. Her podcast moved on to interviews with healers, educators, storytellers. The charts still favored her. The audience remained loyal, and the moment that had ruptured the quiet efforts of peace slowly dissolved into a blur of algorithms and trending sounds. One afternoon, as the light shifted across the empty chairs of the Windsor drawing room, Julian paused while collecting files. He noticed a single envelope left behind in the king's private tray, still unopened, still waiting. He didn't touch it. He simply stood there for a moment, thinking of all the things that had nearly happened. Reconciliation was a quiet thing, he had once said to Malcolm. But words, especially the public kind, could make it vanish even faster than war. Outside, the wind passed through the trees. It didn't carry blame or anger anymore, just the soft echo of something unfinished.